So if you're absent, I'll record the meeting so you can just check on the YouTube channel. I'm assuming that you're not having too much trouble finding that. Hopefully that's going okay. That way you can catch up or double check on things if you need to. I did put a review in for the quiz that'll go live next Wednesday. Part of why I was late, I was putting in the quiz, and yeah, I'm just the technology thing. Although I think I finally, after doing it all summer, figured out how to make it go live exactly when I want it to go live, which will be a minute after midnight on Wednesday. So hopefully that'll be okay. There's 8 questions. There are multiple choice on this one, so hopefully that'll be simple. That's 40 points, and your questions are 30 points. The quiz questions are multiple choice, so you're good to go there. The weekly questions, those I'm anticipating you'll write about a page. I've started to grade some of those. Sorry that I haven't really finished grading all of those. I anticipate finishing that Wednesday during the day. So if you've already turned in question 1, I'll go ahead and finish grading and submit the grades. Anytime that I submit a grade, and if you want to know why I gave you the grade I did, I will put in comments. So unless you get all the points, I may not put in too many comments because you go like, hey, I did that right, so I don't need to know anything. Although I probably will still put in comments even if you got all 10 points. So instead of sending me an email saying like, hey, why didn't I get all the points, first check the comments, because probably the first thing I'll say when you send me the email like, hey, how come I didn't get all the points? I'll probably say, did you check the comments? So check the comments because I put them in there for a reason. And you can always disagree with me. I don't care. So like you can email me and say like, hey, you said I didn't do this, but I think I did. So maybe you should double check. It's not going to hurt my feelings at all. So, you know, but if all you ever do is argue because I gave you 9 instead of 10, I might get tired of that. But, you know, it's the first one. So argue away, do whatever you need to do. And then after the first quiz next week, I'll give you a survey and ask you if you want more questions or fewer questions. No, not fewer. I won't ask you if you want fewer questions because 8 is very few. So, all right, I think that's it for me. Not for class. Don't leave. Please don't leave. Okay. You guys have any questions that you want to ask before we get started? And we'll just kind of go back to the notes and start with the next chapter, which is a lot of moving west and Gilded Age stuff. And then go ahead.
How long? I said quiz, but I meant for like the writing, or not the writing prompts, but for the
weekly question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking a page is probably what most people are writing. There are a couple of folks that I looked at, and your question answer is dangerously close to the length of my question. So if you don't answer, if your answer is shorter than my question, that's just never good. I'm not going to lie. So there are a series of questions in that question that ask you to maybe to discuss certain laws or military reconstruction or, you know, political activity. Just do a few of those things. That'll take you a page. And go ahead.
Would you like it to be double spaced?
Doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter at all. Oh, and somebody answered the question in the comments section. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons that's not cool if you cannot do that. Reason number 1, when I grade it, if you put it in the assignment section, your assignment comes up on the screen and then the rubric comes up next to it. If you put it in the comments section, I can't get the rubric to come up at the same time as your answer. So then I know it shouldn't be that difficult, but it is for me. I've got to kind of tab back and forth between the different screens, and I can't, because of the quirks of that program, I can't get, you know, I can't minimize one and get the other one up there at the same time. So thing number 1, I can't see the rubric while I grade your answer, and that's not cool. So if you happen to put it in the comments section, I probably gave you a 1 out of 10. And I even told you in my comments, that doesn't mean that's your final grade. That was to get your attention, to see if maybe you could put it in the assignment section. Now, if that was you and you can't figure out how to do it, I'm not going to penalize you for that. I'll go back and regrade it, I promise. But that was just to see if you could do that. Thing number 2. If you put it in the comments section, it doesn't go through the plagiarism check. And honestly, the plagiarism check is a little helpful for me. And since half your grade is this, I'd really like to know that it was actually your work. Now, there were 1 or 2 of you that when I don't think I make the results of the plagiarism check visible to you. I suppose I could, if you like, let you know. But my assumption is most of you are not going to plagiarize. Part of the reason that I don't let the plagiarism check show to you is because for almost all of you, it's going to show that you've copied something, but it's typically the question. So if you get a plagiarism result and it says 25%, it's probably the question, and I just don't want you to freak out, you know, which is part of the reason I didn't put it up there. Now, there's 1 or 2 of you where it came up and it's like 90%. That's not a good sign. So please make sure that when you're answering the question, it's just you answering the question. The person that got the big plagiarism check, I mean, some of it's word for word from a website, and I would have noticed that anyway, but it also brought up some other concern that I might have for you. So I'll go ahead and mention this, and then we'll get started with today's stuff. So I don't mean to delay this long, but here's the thing that I think could be problematic. And I had somebody email and say like, hey, can I work with someone else on this? Absolutely. I mean, you can. You guys can talk about stuff like, hey, what did you think about Reconstruction? You guys can exchange numbers. Maybe you know each other. You can make your own Google Meet or whatever. I don't care. That's fine. But the danger in working together is coming up with the exact same answer. So make sure if you discuss this with someone, which makes perfect sense. And, you know, honestly, this is not the first time anyone's ever asked, was Reconstruction successful? Page and a quarter is fine. Yeah, absolutely. This is certainly not the first time anyone's ever answered that question. So you're going to see a whole bunch of that kind of stuff online as well. Don't just copy and paste it. If you work together with each other, make sure you have a talk, but don't have a shared answer that you all submit, okay? Because shared answer that you all submit is going to end up with, you know, bad plagiarism issues for all of you. So, and I completely expect you'll have similar opinions, you know, because, you know, we're not inventing something new here. So I get that your opinions may be the same. If your answer is word for word the same, it's an enormous problem, okay? An enormous problem. So, oh, and you guys have a Discord. Discord, I thought that was just for video gaming. I had no idea that people use that for academic purposes.
I mean, it is primarily used for games, but it works pretty well for anything else, really.
Yeah, I was sponsoring youth in government kind of as an outside volunteer last year, and they put me on a Discord server, and then one of my friends saw it and said, oh, you're a gamer? And I went, no. So that, otherwise I wouldn't have known even that. But yeah, that's cool. You guys should work together. And I think that's one of the things that not being in person kind of limits you on. So if you want to work together, that's so completely fine. Just make sure that you're cautious and you don't turn in all the other stuff. Now, your opinion, I mean, part of what I'm asking in this first question definitely is your opinion. Was Reconstruction successful, not successful, in what ways? But you got to back it up with some facts. Also, I did notice in some of the answers, some of you just listing stuff and not explaining it. So like somebody said, yeah, some laws were passed, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You've got to tell me what those are. And you don't have to explain it in huge detail, but at least tell me, freed the slaves, allowed for citizenship, allowed African Americans to vote. Just a little detail so I know that you've learned something. Or at least, you know, learned it long enough to put it in there. And again, most of the stuff that I've read is pretty good. It's pretty good. I also, if you weren't here last week, I think on Thursday, I might have gone on some little crazy rant where I talked about how if your answer doesn't talk about those amendments, if it doesn't mention the amendments, and it doesn't end, or it doesn't talk about how Reconstruction ended with the bargain of 1877, I might be distressed with you because I kind of think those things matter. Because we don't pass amendments that often. It's pretty rare. You know, I was watching the news this morning, not really news, but some commentary show. And, you know, there's a presidential election, you probably heard. And there's some people really upset about the Electoral College because it's brand new. You know, they never heard of it before, I suppose. And they go, we have to get rid of that thing as soon as possible before the election if we can. It's like, no, that's probably not going to happen. You can hope for it, but that's probably not going to happen. But we only pass constitutional amendments not very often. Probably none in your lifetime. I don't know how old you people are, but the last one, no, we did one in 1990, so you're old enough. We just didn't talk about it much. That one was, if Congress passes a pay raise, then they don't get it, the next Congress does. And that was actually James Madison who wrote that. It was supposed to be Amendment 11, but for whatever reason, they thought 10 was good for the Bill of Rights. So that one actually is a James Madison amendment passed a couple hundred years later, which, see, you're going like, I did not sign on for this today. But, you know, so when we get a constitutional amendment, you got to talk about it. You got it. So put the amendments in there and mention that the end of Reconstruction ends military Reconstruction. You know, that the troops go out, the South gets to be the South again, which is probably not great for very many people. So, except a handful of rich people. All right.
Question about the assignments.
Yes.
How, what's the word I'm looking for? Cited do we need to be when writing our explanation?
If it's in the textbook, you don't need to cite it. I mean, my assumption
Oh,
is
a cite. I meant like for example, a side.
Take a
Like
side.
so, pick
Take
a
a side.
side. Take a
Oh.
side.
Yeah. Let's see.
Because some professors get real, like, they want you to be like, yes, Reconstruction was a failure, or yes, Reconstruction was a success, and this is the reason why. And I would like to look at the pros and cons of both sides and explain that.
Well, and I think that makes sense with this question. You know, if the question were to what extent was Adolf Hitler a good leader, I wouldn't want you to support both sides. I also would not ask you a question like that because it's, you know, it's, I don't know. But yeah, on this one, you can pick both sides. You can take one, take the other. You need to consider both sides. And I think there are clearly some things that are important in a good way that happened during Reconstruction. So even if you think it was a failure, which is fair as well, if you don't mention that they passed 3 constitutional amendments that do allow for greater equality briefly and then eventually 100 years ago, you missed something important. But yeah, pick a side, pick both sides, just use some facts to back up your opinion. And as long as what you say is true and you don't ignore something big, you know, I'm going to be okay. Like if you said, no, everything was completely perfect in Reconstruction and everyone was equal, but you ignore the fact that the troops are taken out of the South and then we have 100 years of systemic racism for sure. I know some people would argue that it continues, but I don't know how you could argue that we didn't create an intentionally racist system in the South after Reconstruction ended. You know, if you argue that everything was perfect during Reconstruction, it's the reason that we have, you know, something approaching equality nowadays, and you ignore that we didn't enforce those amendments or that Reconstruction and protection of equality went away, you got a problem. I mean, you have to talk about the truth. But your conclusions about the truth can be different, which makes life complicated. I did say the quiz is next week. It'll go live. I always, well, not always because I had technical difficulties last semester. But my goal is to make it live starting on Wednesday. So Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, you need to take the quiz.
Okay,
And
thank
it'll-
you. My
you're
dog
welcome.
was barking whenever you started talking about it, and I only caught a little bit of it.
Oh,
That's
sorry.
perfect. No, you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It is tricky working at home with the dogs now. So, yeah. I was on a Zoom meeting yesterday with somebody, some political candidate, and he had a cat crawling on his head. So. All right. Do you guys want to ask anything else before we get started with the stuff? Sorry, my neck's sore. Are you neck sore from Zoom meetings? Glad that I just recorded that comment. All right. I guess to share the notes, I actually have to open them. So let me open them. Old people talking about their technology. All right. Let's see how this goes. Yeah, so the quiz definitely will be available Thursday, starting midnight on Wednesday, I think, is when it's supposed to show up, if I programmed it correctly. Also, if you try to take it on Wednesday and it doesn't show up, send me an email and say like, hey, where's that quiz you talked about? And then I'll go like, oh my gosh, I messed up the technology again, I'm sorry. It tells me that it's gonna go live when it's supposed to be so. I'm gonna assume it's all gonna be good. Oh my goodness, if it's not, I'm gonna be so sad. But again, email me if you notice anything. Okay. All right. No, I'm talking about next week, Wednesday, sorry. The 16th is when the quiz will go live. So the last 3 days of the unit are the days you'll take the quiz. So you do have to take it on the 16th, 17th, or 18th. Now, if for some reason, because some of you've already had some unusual things happen to you in the first couple of weeks of the class where you're less available than you anticipated. If that ends up being the case, just send me an email and we'll figure out a way to, I think I can give you like a special code to get into it or something if you end up having to do it late. But I mean, that has to be a super unusual situation because I'm giving you Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So, do your best to get it. You'll get it done one of those days. You do need to do it all at once. And I'm giving you an hour to do it. And it's 8 questions. So for most of you, it'll take 10 minutes would be my guess. And if you look at the review, there's a review for those. I think I called it the review of the timed questions. I either called it timed question review or quiz question review. That should give you some pretty good clues about what to study. So make sure you look at that. And so today we'll kind of go over the general stuff from chapter 16. We'll go over the rest of it on Thursday. Sorry that I keep rubbing my face. And the weekly question, which, you know what? I don't remember what the weekly question is. Let me check really quick. Sorry that I don't remember. What a day. No, I was just thinking about all of those, getting that quiz in there. Dang, quiz. Okay. Weekly question. And soccer. Oh my gosh. Where's the fall AC? Oh, there we go. Sorry. Weekly question. 16 weekly question is, okay. Native Americans in the Gilded Age, Dawes Act, Ghost Dance, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's a big old question. Okay. Oh, that makes me think maybe I put too much of that kind of stuff on the quiz. All right, back to business. All right, so chapter 16 is about the Gilded Age. And there's lots of stuff that goes on Gilded Age-wise. So we got city stuff and we got Western stuff. And if you're wondering how things develop in the United States during this time period, most of the factory activity where the cities are growing and the businesses are getting big, most of that kind of stuff is going on in the East. And, the West, not too many people live in the West yet, but this is the era where more people are going to move to the West. Plus, we're going to take more land away from Native Americans during this time period. So, and we're also going to harass immigrants in the West, especially Asian immigrants. And if you've already started reading this chapter, you're going like, dang, we were rude to Asians. That is correct. And Mexican Americans also. And you may or may not remember if you took 1301, you might remember, we had a war with Mexico in the 40s, and 1840s, that is. And if you're from Texas, you know, if you're not from Texas, they have a year of Texas history in 7th grade. I'm not from Texas, but you know, those guys really love their Texas history, and they sing songs about prostitutes to kids. Yellow Rose of Texas, I don't know. But anyway, Texas becomes this part of the United States, well, it becomes its own country, and then part of the United States, and helps provoke a war with Mexico, maybe on purpose, maybe not on purpose. So lots of Mexico, essentially the northern half or third, depending on how you do it geography, becomes part of the United States during this time period. And when that happens, of course, the people who lived there go from being Mexican to being part of the United States, and they didn't even move because, you know, somebody just took over their country, or at least they're part of their country. So lots of changes, lots of westward movement during this time period, and enormous expansion of cities. 30 million immigrants coming over, primarily European immigrants, although there's just a boatload, not a boatload, but several groups of folks from Asia coming to the West Coast. And if you're ever wondering, like, why don't we talk Asian immigration? We talk about the East Coast, because geography. So most Asians are going to come to the West Coast, and you'll see some interesting laws created to greet them in not very pleasant way. Okay, so if you're wondering why we're going west during this time period, a couple of reasons. One, railroads. We built some railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad is completed right after the Civil War. I think it's 1869. If you like that kind of stuff, you can read a book about the Transcontinental Railroad, read a book review. This matters in a lot of ways. Now, during this time period, and honestly, in a lot of the world still, most people don't travel very much. You know, you don't really take vacations. And travel is kind of an unusual thing. You have to have money to travel, especially back then, and lots of resources. So railroad doesn't really enhance travel so much during this time period as it enhances commerce. So it creates a national market for items, and it allows companies to ship their items back and forth. That's also why during this time period you create, not you of course, but someone creates chain stores, department stores, the ones that are, you know, falling apart right now. JCPenney, one that kind of collapsed when I was in college, Montgomery Ward, Sears and Roebuck, which I think maybe still marginally operates. But a lot of A&P Grocery, Atlantic and Pacific Grocery, the reason it could be A&P was the railroads. So you could ship stuff back and forth and, you know, get products across the country in a matter of days. So it creates national markets. And, you know, honestly, by the end of this period, it helps create international markets because it gets stuff to the coast and then you can literally ship it overseas. So you can buy the same stuff in California that you could buy in New York, and it's going to create more of a consumer society as well and integrate the American economy. So railroads are hugely important for shipping stuff back and forth. Not so much people, although there will be some people who travel this way, but railroad travel will become more important in the 20th century, kind of trendy. But shipping stuff back and forth, big deal during this time period. And because we're shipping stuff back and forth, and we're starting to have factories where they work, you know, maybe 3 shifts and they work 24 hours. Of course, a certain person doesn't work 24 hours, but you've got a morning, afternoon, and overnight shift. Going to change how we view time, and we're going to create time zones in part because, because we need to make sure that we drop off stuff and pick up stuff at the right time, and we have to clock in at work. So how we view time is going to change, and they're going to create time zones. The time zone thing is definitely a response to the creation of railroads. You've got to make sure you have stuff at the depot in time to load it, and we'll talk more about railroads. Although if you've started to read this chapter, you've noticed they talk quite a bit about railroads because it does integrate the economy, and that's a huge deal. This is also the first time in our history where people will work more for wages rather than for stuff. So we've made really a complete shift away from a barter to a market economy. We'd certainly started that, long before this in the 1820s and 30s, but at this point, more people are working and getting paid rather than working to bring in a crop. Now, I know that does contradict a little bit the idea of sharecropping, but even that is based on getting paid for working on the crop rather than trading the crop for something else. So most people are working for wages, getting paid rather than to produce their product and then trade their product for other products they need. So majority of workers in the United States, starting in this era, we're talking 1870s, 1880s, get paid by the hour. Now, one thing that's kind of weird about that is even though more people are getting paid by the hour, there's no minimum wage. So you get paid the least amount that your employer can get away with paying you. Now that might still be true. It's just the government has set an amount of what the least is. And sometimes, you might live in an urban area where they've established a higher amount than the federal government. If you live in Texas, you probably don't, but at least there is a minimum wage. During this time period, there was no minimum wage. It's also part of the reason, there are several others, but it's part of the reason people really harass whoever the most recent immigrant group is, because those guys bring wages down because they're more desperate for work. So the most desperate people, you can get away with paying them the least, and if there's no minimum wage, that could be next to nothing. And once you have a big group of, say, Irish folks coming in the 1840s, or Italian folks coming in the 1870s, then you get to dog on that group and say, like, because of you, I don't make enough money, and you'll work for nothing, and yeah, there you go. And this will really start to complete the population shift away from rural area to urban majority. And that really happens right around 1900, but the factory systems in the cities and large groups of immigrants moving to cities and the growth of cities on both coasts contribute to this. Okay. So that's your big intro. Do you guys have any questions that you want to ask? Okay. All right. All right. Oh, okay. If somebody somebody apparently is unmuted. So you may want to mute if there's still the echo going on, although you guys may have fixed that and I may not have noticed that comment. Okay, rich guys. This is what we all aspire to be. Maybe, I don't know. Not me so much, but money is good. During this time period, there is an assumption, especially toward the end of it, that if you come to the United States, you will become fabulously wealthy. I know when I taught high school forever, all of my students were very sure that their first year out of college, or maybe even high school for some of them, they would make way more money than I ever made as a U.S. history teacher. And I think the only student I ever had that did that, actually his parents owned some land, and each year gave him a cow for his birthday, which sounds like a peculiar gift, but it works in Texas, I think. So by the time he was a senior, I think he did make more than I did from his cattle business. And, God bless him. I mean, that was cool for him. So I always would tell them, when you become wealthy, let me know. These guys became wealthy. And okay, so none of them were really overnight successes, but they really go from either rags to riches in Carnegie's instance or just like lower middle class to riches for Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. Well, yeah, or solidly upper middle class, Vanderbilt and Morgan, to riches to I don't know, whoever, big money, like Vanderbilt and Morgan. All right, so we'll talk about these guys really quickly because they are sort of the icons of the era. You know, they were the guys that people aspired to be. And a couple of them were immigrants or their parents had immigrated. So, you know, this is the poor guy does well, rags to riches, especially Carnegie. Okay. Vanderbilt Cornelius is from the New York area. He didn't like school. So he quit it around 12, which isn't super unusual for that time period for people to only go until they're about 12 and then go to work. In that time period, I'm talking 1840s, because he's the oldest of this group. So Vanderbilt has a shipping business. His parents tell him when he's 12, like, son, if you want to drop out, you've got to work, so we'll buy you your first boat. And, you know, now that Trump is president, really during his campaign, I remember him saying, you know, he got a small loan of $1 million from his parents to start his business. I think Vanderbilt's kind of in a similar situation where he gets what he would think of as a small loan, but for most people would be unattainable, you know, for your parents to buy you a boat that you could use to ship things across the bay or the harbor in New York City. So he runs a local shipping business, and then makes it more of a national shipping business when you're actually shipping with ships, and then runs a big business where he ships things across South America, and gained some fame and notoriety, and business during the Civil War, right as railroads are starting to become a thing. So he starts to build railroads and starts to ship things across the country for the Union Army. And he also helps put up telegraph lines using his shipping company. So he's gonna occasionally brag that he was the first casualty of the Civil War, because I think he got shot or nicked or hurt or something. I don't remember the story because I'm not a huge historian of Vanderbilt, I suppose. But he gets injured putting up an early telegraph line. Now, if you like to watch history and you guys have a lot of free time, I know some of you are doing the Netflix thing, they may have, there's a series called The Men Who Built America, and it features these guys plus Henry Ford, who's younger during that era. But it's a really good History Channel series that kind of brings this stuff to light and to life, I suppose. So it's a little more like a soap opera, which honestly is kind of legitimate. These guys were a little bit of a mess in some ways, and they all knew each other and competed with each other, but not directly because their industries were different. Okay. So Vanderbilt becomes really wealthy. He wants to move from wherever he lived, not in New York City, just kind of on an island, to central New York City. His wife didn't want to go. So he said, hey, if you don't go, I'm just going to have you committed to a mental health institution, which of course is not what they would have called it back then. And you could, if you were wealthy and connected, you could commit people against their will. And so she agreed to move in town in New York City. Later on, he'll remarry a cousin, which is not really that crazy during that time period, although, you know, we have genetics and biology now that's a little more advanced, so it's really a bad idea for a lot of reasons. But she'll make him more charitable. At first, he's not very charitable. It's like, I made this money, I'm not donating it. But he establishes a university, which he names Vanderbilt University, which, you know, kind of makes sense, and endows it pretty heavily. So they're still okay with money because of him. Now, he doesn't do a whole lot of other charitable stuff compared to the other guys, but there is sort of an odd expectation that we're all Bill Gates like during this time period. If we make a lot of money, we should also give a lot of money away. And that expectation really is voiced by Andrew Carnegie, but all of these guys follow it to a certain extent. Vanderbilt to the least of that extent. What his railroad in New York becomes is the New York Central Railroad. He builds Grand Central Station. He has a bunch of kids. I think it's, think about it, 13. Pretty sure it's 13. He's got 10 daughters and 3 sons. His favorite son, and there was no doubt he had favorite kids. Oh my. His favorite son died in the Civil War. And then he had a son with epilepsy that he made fun of and said was weak. He's not a super nice person. And then his son, William Vanderbilt, really kind of took the family business and doubled and tripled the fortune. And then the next generations are to spend most of the money and then kind of have a little, like a mini economic collapse, which becomes a bigger one during the Great Depression. So that family doesn't have as much money as the other families we're going to talk about remaining. Now, you don't have to feel too sorry for them. I think, you know, they all still get to go to good colleges and live in nice houses, but they all essentially have to have jobs. Gloria Vanderbilt was probably the most prominent Vanderbilt in my generation. She was a fashion designer and I think wrote a little bit. And her son, Anderson Cooper, is the most famous surviving Vanderbilt, I think, at this point. Yeah, that's all your Vanderbilt trivia for today. Rockefeller, John D. His parents were kind of lower middle class sort of dudes, and his dad sold essentially fake medicine. So he said, here's some cough syrup, but it was really alcohol. And it would make you feel better, but, you know, probably didn't solve your problems. He was a little embarrassed about his dad and wanted to be a little more legit. He starts an oil company. And his oil company creates at first kerosene and heating oil for your house. And it's in an era where they just started doing that, and people weren't very cautious about how they made it. Manufacturers weren't very cautious. And so what he did was emphasize the importance of chemistry in developing a formula and manufacturing standards. So they called it Standard Oil because you knew you could count on it not blowing your house up when you used it. Now, that's a really important quality in heating oil and, you know, something to light your lamps. So having something safe that heats your house and lights it up, it's really, you know, it's smart. So he has a huge emphasis on chemistry and production standards in his company. And he will practice, your book talks about this to a pretty good extent, both vertical and horizontal integration strategies. And vertical, I always have to think about this to make sure I get it right. So vertical integration strategies are where you buy things that help you control all aspects of your product. So, you know, you not only do you buy the oil well, you buy the railroad that helps you take the oil to the refinery, you buy the refinery, you buy the retail outlet. So you buy the oil tankers, he buys a lot of stuff. So he's got a very, even though his product line is not very diverse, because he's bought all aspects of production, he controls his price really well. And then he also practices horizontal integration. Really, that's just where you buy out your competitors. So he would try to pressure people into selling to him if they didn't want to, because he owned the refinery, or he owned the local railroad, or he owned the oil tankers. Occasionally he owned banks as well. He just pressured them through some other aspect of the business to sell to him. So if he offered you money for your oil business and you told him no, he'd raise your shipping rates or your refinery rates, or he would just undersell you because he had a larger quantity. So he'd take a loss for 5 or 6 months, and then your business would go under. So Rockefeller definitely is a monopolist kind of guy. He's also more charitable, I suppose, in ways than Vanderbilt. He endows the University of Chicago, especially the chemistry, chemistry, it mattered to him. And that university, I think, still has a pretty good chemistry department. And I had students go there to study economics as well. His church, he's a super Baptist kind of dude, so he's tithing. And if you're the church that receives the tithe from Rockefeller, that's a good deal. Tithe, for those of you who aren't super Baptist or as Protestant, I don't know if Catholics do this or not, but tithe is 10% of your income. And there's sort of a tradition that's certainly alive during that era, probably not as much now, where you give 10% of your income to your church. So if you got to receive 10% of Carnegie's income, you know, that's a huge bonus for your church. And so he's very consistent at donating to his church. And I said Carnegie, but I meant Rockefeller. Carnegie's not a Baptist. Rockefeller's the Baptist. So his church and also the Rockefeller Foundation, which helped kids who were really poor, and especially with health and nutrition issues. And they still do that. That's still around to this day. The main thing that they helped with, aside from just nutrition, food, during that era, was helping cure a disease called, oh goodness, it gets in your feet, hookworm, which was more of a southern problem than a northern problem. Honestly, kids would go barefoot in the south, especially in places where they raised hogs. The hookworm lives in hog poop, and they get in your feet and they kind of nest in your feet, and it makes your feet rot. Now there's medications you can take that help, you know, get over that quickly. It's too early for penicillin or something, but they develop some medications. However, the best way to make sure you don't get that is wear shoes, which is not a very southern thing in the South for poor people, or a southern thing in the summer, excuse me, for poor people in that era. And honestly, where I grew up in the Ozarks, middle of the country, kind of a poor area, you know, we got a pair of shoes a year. So our parents really encouraged us not to wear shoes in the summer because we didn't want to wear them out and then we wouldn't have any shoes for school. So your shoes were for school, and in the summer you ran around barefoot. My parents didn't raise hogs, chickens. Guess hookworm didn't grow in chicken poop. So, all right, there you go. Find out all kinds of things you didn't want to know. Carnegie is a steel company. He started off, this is the one who started off super, super poor. He's an immigrant from Scotland, and his dad was a weaver. So he made cloth by hand, which is not very profitable. And Carnegie was kind of embarrassed a little bit about his dad too, because he's kind of backward. Why is everybody's embarrassed about their dads? What's up with that? Okay, sorry. So the problem with his dad is he didn't make enough money to support the family. So Carnegie has to work starting at about 11 or 12, which you're starting to gather is not super unusual during this time period. And he works at a textile factory. They made cloth, and he was a bobbin boy. So he spun thread on a spool, essentially, and then they put that on the loom. But he rose up pretty quickly. He was pretty good at accounting, that sort of thing. So he worked in the accounting department and then started saving money and invested it in an oil company, and then eventually used that money to buy a steel company. So he's really big on investment and really big on steel. He may have stolen some formulas and something called the Bessemer process for creating steel from some British manufacturers, and he will eventually control about 90% of the international steel market. And Rockefeller's going to be about that high with the oil market as well. You're probably gathering that some of these guys will create, well, these guys create monopolies. They do. They'll be broken up later, sort of, kind of. But Carnegie becomes the major steel manufacturer in the world, creates the Carnegie Foundation, really emphasizes culture and education because these are things he missed out on as a young person. And he along with Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, started Carnegie Mellon University, where a lot of his money still is. And the Carnegie Foundation is still a multi-billion-dollar foundation. So his money definitely is still around. Made an odd promise to his mother that he would not marry and while she was still alive, because she was afraid that if he got married, he wouldn't take care of her financially. And she had been kind of insecure about finances, you know, because things didn't go so well when they were younger. Um, so he kept that promise, and she lived to be about 80. So he gets married really late in life and has one kid who doesn't inherit much money by the standards of the size of their fortune, because I think by the time he retired, he was worth about $500 million, which was more money than countries during that time period. And if you translated it into modern money, I can't imagine how many trillions of dollars it would be. It'd be ridiculous. There's something online that can do that for you, like the money converter over time or something. But he is phenomenally wealthy. And he gets married late in life and then has one kid who inherits something like $20 million. But her job is the head of the Carnegie Foundation. So her job's giving away money. So huge bonus. That's a cool job. And he lives a long time too. He lives through the Great Depression. So he's, yeah, okay. He writes something called The Gospel of Wealth, which is really more of an essay than a book, because I know some of you are probably thinking, I could read that for my book review. Probably not. But in this, he says that wealthy people, and I think this version of the book has an excerpt of it. I'll have to go back and check. But he says that wealthy people shouldn't give all their money to the kids because it'll make them spoiled and lazy. And they should give as much of their money away as possible, you know, to help society, because you only need so much money. So you should use that money for good. And he thinks that you should figure out before you die how you want to spend that money. So create a trust, something like that, so you will have control over how that money is spent, and you can pick someone you trust to administer that trust. And he did all of those things. Now, the one thing that is true, I didn't really mention this, of working for these guys, you know how charitable they seem? Not so much to their employees. So if you worked for them, they were cheap and you worked in a dangerous place. Yeah, and they didn't care about your safety and they underpaid you. And that's super typical of employers during that time period. But if they donated to you, like I got a buddy in, where does she live? West Texas somewhere, I think it's near Abilene, where she does an annual fundraiser for the Carnegie Foundation, because the Carnegie Foundation still helps to fund their local libraries. So, you know, they're incredibly charitable unless you work for them, and then it's dangerous and terrible. Okay, the last guy's JP Morgan. JP Morgan's dad was an incredibly wealthy banker, incredibly successful banker, who mostly told him, you'll never be as smart as me. And he ends up starting the financial business, which is JP Morgan Chase. So if you're wondering how that turned out for him, it worked out pretty well. He's known as being pretty ruthless in his business consolidation finance deal. He also is going to buy railroads. He's going to, I think most of the wealthier people that deal with him sort of think that he treats them pretty well. But he does what you do if you run a bank. You make money by loaning money to other people, so you earn interest on those loans. And if those loans fall through, you repossess stuff and then sell it. So, I mean, it may look predatory, because sometimes it probably is, but it's legal. Now, all of these guys talking about legal donate ridiculous amounts of monies to politicians so that the things they do remain legal. So they may or may not be ethical in some ways. Their goal really is to make as much money as possible, which, I mean, it's capitalism. So, you know, and it's Texas, so probably, you know, most people here think, I mean, they're not from Texas, but I mean, most people, I think, probably agree with some of their philosophy, but they don't necessarily treat their employees well. And they're hard on their competitors. I mean, in some ways unethical, but not necessarily illegal. Now, any of these guys, if the workers would go on strike, they would hire private armies to put down the strike, which was legal during that time period, would not be now. And more than one of them would eventually be called in front of the Congress for a hearing where they would ask them if they thought that their tactics against their employees or their competitors were moral. And they mostly would respond like, it's legal. Their questions weren't about morality necessarily. So Morgan makes his money from business consolidation and finance. He made, I think, the first huge chunk of money by helping railroad companies consolidate, stop building lines to the same cities. And so he worked as a business advisor, consultant. His major charities are in the New York City area. He endowed museums, art galleries, local city charities, and I guess the biggest collegiate recipient was Harvard Medical School. So he definitely was charitable locally. All right, rich guys. Whew. All right. So because the economy is growing so quickly during this time period, and there are very few rules about how you can make money, how you issue stocks, how stocks are sold and financed and stuff, this is an amazing time for a handful of wealthy people. And the economy itself expands pretty quickly, and work changes to where you're working for wages. And also part of the reason that you see the economy changing quickly is this is a very mechanized phase of the Industrial Revolution. So before I talk about workers during this time period, I'll stop sharing, see if any of you have questions. Okay. Why is there no mention of the I don't know the answer to why let me peek in your book, because I don't recall, and I know I didn't put them in my notes. I'm sorry, Moody family. Let me peek in your index and see. You guys have your books handy, right? I mean, I'm probably the only one who's like, I got my book right here by the computer. Let me see. I feel like they're not in there, so. I don't know why. I don't know. But, that's also while you're thinking about, or while we're talking about this, when you're reading through the book or when I'm going through the notes, if there's something you feel like Foner leaves out, because he's necessarily going to have to, notice how I quickly went to blame Foner. Did you notice that? Partly because he's not here, but and maybe it's practice for me becoming a politician later on in my life. But if there's stuff that you feel like really should have been covered more in the book, oh, there we go, D.L. Moody, an evangelist kind of Moody, yeah. And he's important. My pastor went to Moody Bible Institute. I think that's in Chicago, right? So it's a big deal. Feel free, and honestly, yeah, we don't talk so much about religious history in this class. Occasionally it comes up, but there's an enormous revival that he's a part of that happens toward the end of the 19th century that is kind of tied into this gospel of wealth and the social gospel, which we'll mention a little bit as well. You'll see that a little bit more in the progressive era. So you see that kind of coming about in the late part of the 1900s, and then yeah, there's just like a really quick mention of him, and it's probably just in passing, and it's probably just Dwight or D.L. Moody because he's such a prominent preacher during this era. But you see the effects of that in the social gospel movement that you see a little bit more in the progressive era. So we'll talk a little bit more, maybe not as directly about him as you would like, but oh goodness, yeah, it's tricky because whoever writes the book is going to pick and choose what they put in. And I would always mention to you and to anyone that would listen to me, you're sort of captive and have no choice, but The difficulty with a textbook like this, oh, nice, yeah. The difficulty with the textbook like this is whoever decides to write the book decides what they leave out. It's not that they put in stuff that's not true. It's just they have to leave stuff out. Otherwise, the book would be, 5 times as long. And they may leave out something you think is important. It is true. So, but yeah, feel free to, read about that person for your book review or that family for your book review, or, add them in if it fits. It won't fit in this weekly question because I don't think they had very much to do with Native Americans. But, if it fits in the weekly question, toss them in as well. Yeah, I mean, it's a survey class, so we're hitting the big stuff, but sometimes we miss some of the big stuff too. All right, questions or comments? Others? Goodness, sorry, so thirsty. All right, so as you have probably guessed, and I'll put the notes back up here in a second, this is not a good time to work in a factory. Yeah, and you saw in the last chapter, it's also not a good time to be poor in the South and be somebody's sharecropper, or work on your super cheap farm and probably lose your land pretty quickly. But this is a terrible time to work in a factory. Terrible time to work in a factory because of what's not there. No minimum wages. Wow, when I pointed, my hand looked really big. So no minimum wages. I'm going to point from back here. You don't have any workers' safety laws, so that's 2 things. And if you get hurt at work, you just get fired. This is a terrible time. It's unsafe. You're underpaid. What else is there? It's unsafe and you're underpaid. So worker protections were few and far between, and there's no minimum wage. There's no maximum hours per week. If you work 60 hours a week, they can pay you whatever they want to pay you. Sometimes they pay you by the week. They'll say like, hey, I'll pay you $50 this week, but you got to work 6 days and you may work 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Honestly, it's very common during this time period to have a 6-day work week, and you won't really see it change to it being, more like a 5-day work week until we get closer to the 20th century, honestly, early 1900s. So this is a very bad time to have, it's a tough time to be poor. That sounds like a dumb thing to say because like when is a good time to be poor? However, yeah, okay. So very few protections. The government's really not on your side. Well, and truthfully, during this era, the only side the government's on is rich people's side because they're donating a bunch of money. There's really no worker protections, but the government just kind of stays, I don't want to say they stay out of stuff because that's not true. If they do stuff, it's to help large businessmen. So the government intervening to try to make your day-to-day life better, we don't see that at all during this era. You'll start to see that in the 20th century. A little bit during the progressive era, then it goes away, and then it comes back. So this modern government that solves people's problems, or I know some of you go like, no, it doesn't. It makes them worse. But the government that tries to step in and solve problems, we don't have that during this era, except for Native Americans. It'll try to solve the problem of Native Americans being Native Americans. So, but that's our topic for next time, so I don't want to spoil it. All right, let me go back to sharing. Okay, sorry. All right, so workers during this time period, very few protections, but you will start to see the development of labor unions. Some of them are fairly successful locally. Others are more successful nationally, but none of them are very successful during this time period because there's no rules to protect them, and rich guys have a lot of money. And if you go on strike, rich guys can hire a private army to shoot at you, and that's legal. So It's a very strange time period. Okay, so if you are a skilled worker, when is it not better to be a skilled worker? But if you have a skill that can't be duplicated by a machine, this is probably a good time. Or you can run, like you're a machinist where you make tools, my goodness, that's probably a good time for you. But the more unique and skilled your job is, still true, the better off you are. And technology is changing fairly rapidly for them during that era. Nothing close to the way it's changing for you guys as workers. But having a skill, keeping up with technology really matters. If you are the guy who runs the pretty basic machine that does the same thing 100 times every day, your wages are going to be bad. And your workplace, especially in the beginning of this era, like we're talking 1870s, early 1880s, going to be pretty unsafe. And because they're inventing machines to do stuff faster and better, but they don't care if it's safer because there's no, I don't want to be completely cynical, but there's no laws that require them to care about your safety in the workplace. And the economy is growing just enormously rapidly. I mean, this is probably the largest expansion. We need a true economist here, but the largest expansion of the US economy, you know, forever, in our history. However, what they point out, and they're correct, this expansion doesn't equally benefit different groups of people. The top 1% in the country earn the same amount of money as half of the rest of the country. That's a lot. That's a lot. Yeah. So, and this is also an era where there's no income tax. No income tax. And the book talks pretty extensively about a book called Sunshine and Shadow in New York. And there's another book called How the Other Half Lives that it doesn't talk about quite as much. But both of those books, pretty prominent. And you could find them and read those for your book review. I have not read Sunshine and Shadow, true, you know, that's my confession of the day. I have read How the Other Half Lives. You can find that thing online too if you're like super cheap, which I respect. But How the Other Half Lives goes through different neighborhoods in New York City. Sunshine and Shadow is pretty similar as well, and talks about workplaces and where they live and how difficult their lives, the lives of these different, especially immigrant groups are, who work and live in New York City. And there's also no rules that govern how apartments are built, how many apartments can be in a certain complex, how many rooms there can be per apartment. So it's pretty common for a floor, like an apartment floor, to share a bathroom or two. And the higher up you were in the building, the less likely the bathroom was to work. So you usually had a bucket for, you can just imagine, and a lot of times people just toss those buckets out the window. So it was really common if you lived and worked in New York City, especially in these areas where the factories and the tenement buildings, the apartment buildings, cheap apartment buildings were, you always had an umbrella. Always, always, always. So, and of course the sanitation in those areas was terrible and disease spread quickly, and yeah, it is pretty rough. It is. Okay. I was just noticing it's kind of late. You were probably already noticing that, weren't you? So I probably don't want to get into even like an introduction of the West. So we'll talk about the West next time, which is good because, you know, our weekly question has to do with the Native Americans who tended to be in the West. Okay. Now, before we go, it's almost time. Is there anything you guys want to ask before we log off? I didn't share a little.
I'm pretty good.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something else? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, it was just, I don't have any questions.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to say? You guys have elected Hunter as spokesperson for today. It's fine. All right, somebody else. When does the next video go up? The video of today's lecture? What's tricky for me is I've got I guess that's what you're asking, right? I've got a class at noon, so I can't really post them between classes. So it'll probably go up after the noon class is done. So I'll try to get, but then I've got a class again at 2:20. So I'll try to get them up before my 2:20. Whose idea was that? So weird. I'll try to get them up before that class. But if not, it'll be right after, because I've got some other meeting at 5:30. So that should give me enough time after the 2:20 class ends at 3:45, I think. So I should be able to get it up before 5 o'clock. Okay, let me stop recording.